Hey, what's going on, everybody out there? This is Jakejames Lugo, senior editor here at thekoalition.com, and welcome to a brand new episode of TK Spotlight, where I bring on phenomenal individuals from throughout the gaming industry in various corners of the internet and talk about the good that they've done, talk about awesome stuff in gaming, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff that you guys are going to enjoy. But for today, I got a special guest. I got Kevin Knocke, okay, who is the VP of eSports over at RektGlobal. We're going to talk about eSports today. So, Kevin, welcome. Thanks for coming on to the show with me. How you been?
Phenomenal individuals. I think I don't know if I'm going to live up to that, but geez, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. No, I'm doing great. Just settled into a new home here in New York City, exploring the East Coast a bit. So I've been great. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Over at the Big Apple. I used to live in New York for like about over 20-something years over there. I love New York. I mean, I moved down south and stuff, but I love that city over there. So you're going to have a good time living over there, checking out everything. So we're going to talk about esports because you know esports. You know a whole bunch of stuff about that. And pretty sure I haven't really had anybody on the show to really kind of, elaborate a little bit about what esports is, what the whole culture is about, and all these other things that have been associated with it in the gaming news and just all around the internet and stuff. So for the common person out there, okay, it might sound a little silly or whatnot, but what is esports? Like, why is this term that everybody really throws around?
Yeah, absolutely. So esports is the organized industry of people who play competitive games professionally, and that's probably the easiest way to explain it. So, when you were growing up and playing first-person shooters, and you always told your buddy, like, I would kick your ass any day of the week at this game. And then you threw down a few bucks for that. Well, now a few bucks is almost a couple $1 billion. And that's how big this industry is now, as we have professional gamers that have contracts worth millions of bucks. They're making real livings. And the industry just continues to grow at a breakneck pace. So it's been a pleasure to be part of it. And hopefully it keeps going.
Yeah, like I know that a lot of people kind of get like the messaging a little bit muddied all over the place, especially through a lot of discussion and stuff. But pretty much esports players or just competitive players comes from any type of genre, comes from any type of, I guess, style of game and such. And they're kind of being treated like, real athletes, like in professional sports, including like basketball, baseball, etc. More traditional sports. Would you say like they've been kind of, evolving over time and kind of like becoming the new type of athlete moving on into the future?
That's a really interesting question. I want to answer this a couple of different ways, because if you ask me personally, I don't necessarily consider people who compete in esports to be athletes per se. I do consider them to be the same style of competitor, though. And here's what I mean by that. So, I work in this crossover world between traditional sports and esports right now, where a lot of traditional sports folks are starting to get involved in the industry, starting to buy teams, invest in teams, starting to sponsor leagues, stuff like that. And what I've noticed is that everyone who comes from this industry basically repeats one line. When they say, "Oh, when we were growing up, we all played just baseball and football. That's what there was." And so naturally, we wanted to go watch people do that at a high level. We wanted to see the best in the world at those particular games. And in that sense, esports is really no different. People of this generation who grew up with video games largely are becoming very good at them. And we see that this entire industry of esports has risen out of people that just want to see these people play professionally, just as if they were doing any other sort of sport. So that to me is very interesting. And something that I've always said about esports is that, let's imagine that you are someone who's 5 feet tall, 95 pounds.
All right.
I don't care how naturally gifted of a linebacker you are. You will never see a football field.
You will get steamrolled by linebackers, practically. You got to get rolled over.
That's exactly right. And there is no place, unfortunately, for certain groups of people in traditional athletics. However, behind a mouse and keyboard, behind a controller, it doesn't matter if you're tall, short, fat,
it's more open-ended.
White, black, man, woman. It doesn't matter. We are all the same. And I believe that sort of competitive nature of this is what makes esports so cool and pretty akin to sports.
Definitely. Now, there's been a lot of talk more recently, I want to say within the last couple of months, actually, maybe even longer if possible, where a lot of people have been wanting to see esports or just competitive gaming in general be represented in the Olympics. That's been a big hot topic of debate, where we had different committees here and there talking about if competitive gaming is considered sports, it should be looked at as real sports. Should it be considered amongst the other different events within the 2020 Olympics, etc.? I mean, where do you stand on that? Do you feel like, at some point competitive gaming or just electronic gaming or whatever people want to call it could be considered along that pantheon of traditional sports with the Olympics?
I don't think it has to in order to gain that credibility. I think we're in a weird spot, and I'm also a big sports fan as well in general. So if I go way too long on this answer, you just punch me across the internet.
No, it's all
here.
good.
But I firmly believe that actually it's kind of the other way around. It's the Olympics to a degree with declining viewership and such that is actually looking for ways to expand their definition of what's competitive to people who are more engaged in broadly more niche industries, as younger generations tend to be. And so I think that it's not necessarily that esports needs the Olympics or anything like that. I don't think it would hurt. I'm not one of those people who thinks that it's a bad fit for esports to be present in the Olympics, but honestly, they have enough problems on their own right now with doping scandals, getting countries completely out of competition, declining viewership, as I mentioned before, that I'm not so worried if the Olympics is going to pick up esports or not. I think it would be cool, but it's not necessary for it to be relevant, in my opinion.
Do you think that it eventually will happen, though? Because I feel like there's a lot more growing support for it, and there's been a lot of compelling arguments all over the place, whether it was for or against. But I feel like, as we go through the years, like we get going towards that 2020 Olympics, if not 2024 Olympics, I believe it is, or later on than that, where, there's going to be other stuff that not only is going to attract other people's attention, but also is going to be just a sign of the times. Like, gaming has been growing at an exponential rate as an entertainment medium, but just also as a part of, pop culture. And I feel like that's going to be something that might get integrated to other aspects that weren't necessarily kind of, really looking at or associated with gaming in the past before. Do you think it'll still happen, though?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think something like that could happen. It's weird to me because it's funny if you talk to Rick Fox. So Rick Fox is the owner of Echo Fox, obviously a former professional basketball player. He's a well-known celebrity.
He knows sports.
Yeah, exactly. He does everything. I had him on my. I used to host a show on Sirius XM for a little while about esports, and I had him on the show one time, and we were talking about this concept. Are people who play competitive video games athletes? Is this a sport? This whole sort of general conversation. And he goes red in the face and will stop you in your tracks and talk your ear off if you don't believe these folks are athletes. He has this whole speech prepared. When I was a competitive athlete, we all had the same look in our eye when we want to win a championship.
He's very passionate.
These kids have it too. They have the exact same look, the exact same determination. So, if enough people consider these folks to be truly professional or top of their game, irrespective of whether they're athletes or not, if enough people have that sort of respect for people who play competitive video games, I think the comparisons to sports are just going to stop. It's, it really is kind of its own thing, its own industry. And I think it kind of succeeds because of that. It's emblematic of where we are as a society in viewing things online, getting into more niche interests, accessibility of live streaming content. I think it just hits all of those. And whether or not it's a sport, I don't know if that's going to matter long term.
Now, here's the funny thing about that, because I kind of a little bit on the flip side of this as far as how I view it and such. But the reason being is because not only do I feel like a lot of people get caught up on, with the comparison to the physicality of it, because obviously traditional sports are more physical. You're using your body, you're doing active things as compared to gaming. Even though you're still actively playing with a controller, you're still essentially just sitting down in one place and stuff. And I think that's where people get caught up and such. But where I feel like is a much more interesting discussion is the way that the players are held up to different standards. Because obviously in the past, with the NBA, the MLB, etc., whatever sports league, there's a certain level, I guess, a code of conduct amongst the players and also the people that are associated with the teams that a lot of people have to follow. And I feel like there hasn't been really any sort of governing body or any sort of organization that's really figured that out yet. I know we have the MLB, we have the World Championship Gaming Tour and stuff like that we have posted all over the place. But then you have, different, I guess you could say, groups or communities, like the fighting game community or the Smash community or the FPS community, where it feels like they almost either they try or they try not to police themselves a little bit, or at least follow some sort of code of conduct. And this is where we get all these crazy stories in the news, these controversies and stuff, where a lot of people kind of look down on gaming because of that. And that's really where a bulk of a lot of the arguments against gaming being accepted amongst these ranks really stem from, or at least come from in some fashion like that. I mean, do you have any sort of stance on that? Do you have any sort of opinions on that?
I mean, this is where I'm a little bit cynical about this, right? I believe that someone's disposition against gaming is a largely generational thing. And we're even seeing that start to change. So you still have a lot of old stodgy types that are like, oh,
the traditionals
playing video games. These are people who won't get out of their mom's basement. In which, by the way, I need to mention that I did in fact get my start commentating out of my mom's basement. My wife yelling from the adjoining room, "Shut the hell up!"
That's the hustle. That's a real hustle right there.
Yeah. But anyway, so I do think that there is that perception, but I think that's fading. I think as gaming becomes more ubiquitous, as we start to see more and more folks, especially of older generations, that pick up gaming, whether or not it's simply mobile games or, I mean, I just came back from my grandparents' house not but a couple of days ago. I was back in my hometown for some business, and my 79-year-old grandfather was sitting there and going, I just really wanted one of those Nintendo Classics, but they kept getting scalped everywhere. And then he had to show me this Chinese knockoff thing that he had gotten that had 400 games and explain to me how he couldn't get past the first Bowser and Mario. And he was excited. He was having fun with it. And so I think as we go along generationally, that sort of perception is just going to naturally go away. And so, when people really get onto these professional teams and they start to see a lot of the framework that gets put around them, you're looking, these players have coaches, they have trainers, they have nutritionists, they have physical trainers, they have the whole 9 yards. This is really being turned into a professional outfit. This is something that approximates traditional athletic teams and sports. And so I think with more and more professionalization, with gaming becoming more ubiquitous, as I mentioned before, that sort of perception is just going to kind of go away over time.
Now, what about the flip side of that? Because I find it, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people have seen this discussed on social media, where there seems to be a lot of, or at least old school gamers or old school heads, in certain communities, more specifically, just for the sake of example, the fighting game community, where they don't want things to kind of change in the way, where it progresses, where things become a little bit much more professional, things become a little bit much more bigger and taken on a grander level, because they feel like the community itself, or just the genre, or just the nature of the games itself, will lose their identity. You find a lot of people where they feel like the term esports is a dirty word or a dirty phrase to be thrown around, almost kind of like an insult to the purity of, I guess, either the craft or just like the essence of like what makes those communities or what makes those kinds of games so special. I mean, personally, for me, I don't think it's a bad thing as things change over time, but do you feel differently?
I mean, I don't really know how I properly feel about that or want to parse that, to be honest, because like on one hand, I see that as gaming is becoming more and more professional, like there's a lot of added benefits to it. We have a lot more rigidity and structure. It's much easier for sponsors to get involved, and that's a lot of what I work with right now. It's easier for broadcasters to want to pick up content for it. But on the other hand, you have a pretty strong and vocal fan base within esports that says, no, you need to let games be games. It's about primarily having fun. It needs to have that less rigid, less professional attitude about it. And I think that the right answer is somewhere in the middle. I think that there needs to be a balance that's struck between why we got into this industry in the first place, why we enjoy games just as games and as a fun escape and a fun enterprise, and balance that against the necessary professionalism that the scene, or at least minimum professionalism that the scene has to kind of project to the world in order to still be acceptable for mass consumption, I guess, so to speak.
I agree, and that kind of is a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about next, is that in the past, we've had shows both online and even on TV in places like DirecTV where it's tried to show and really kind of, display that competitiveness, the organization of it, of competitive gaming or just esports in general, where we've had stuff like the Capcom Cross Counter TV, I think it was Cross Counter TV, or the thing that they did between Street Fighter Cross Tekken, between Tekken players and Capcom players or Street Fighter players. We've had also the World Championship Gaming Tour, which was on DirecTV, where some people felt like for one reason or another, some of those things either were somewhat successful or just weren't as successful, and it kind of like gave everybody maybe a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth. What do you think is the one thing that places, whether it be like a television network like ESPN or something, hasn't really kind of caught on to make displaying gaming on those types of channels outside of the internet so successful, or at least, something to get excited about and something to be of interest for mass people?
To be honest, I think that a lot of, and you saw this trend a couple of years ago where a bunch of major traditional media broadcasters kind of got involved in esports in some capacity. Yahoo started an esports division. ESPN, as you referenced, started an esports division. But most of those have closed by this point. And it's not due to esports, reaching its peak and going in decline. No, we're growing faster than ever. And I think the problem is that not enough folks are willing to carve out content that is made for that audience. They want to rely on either things they've done in the past, such as, oh, this worked for other traditional sports, doing match recaps and traditional, statistics and news updates. And so they tried to apply that to esports, and that just didn't work. And I think that kind of largely speaks to your point, because you have to have content that is developed with the esports viewer in mind. This is not an audience that wants to sit down and just read 5 pages of analysis necessarily. They either want to consume video in a live format. They want to have content that's a lot more niche, that's driven by explicit influencers. They want content that truly speaks to them, and that's just not provided right now. So I don't think it's necessarily ESPN came into the space, and if ESPN can't make it work, that means that esports, is doomed with a traditional media audience or something. No, you just got to understand why that fan consumes the media they do and then creates stuff against that. And I just don't think that any big media outlets are really doing that right now.
Do you think it's also because there hasn't been that one person that really understands that, or understands how to kind of convey that, or be that bridge of communication between the two sections? Like, for example, perfect example, I think that's a good parallel to it. Like Jeff Keighley, who recently did the Game Awards. He's been doing that for a while now, and he understands like being able to present that type of thing to a mass audience as like an award show, very similar to like the Grammys, the Oscars, but for gaming specifically, while understanding the business savvy and the business side of things. Do you feel like maybe because esports or just competitive gaming has so many communities, has so many different outlets and facets to it, it's such a complicated thing that we don't have like those specific individuals, specific personalities to be like that representation, to put out there in the forefront to make that type of thing happen?
Well, I think that going into this, a lot of people have a misconception of esports as kind of a monolithic enterprise. Essentially that it's you have everyone who is a fan of one esport must be a fan of all of them, right? And in reality, it's actually a lot more like traditional sports in that regard. Someone who's a fan of baseball is not necessarily a fan of football, is not necessarily a fan of basketball, right? You do have the occasional crossover fan between all of those activities, but generally you're a fan of what you're a fan of, and that's about all you want, right? And the same thing kind of applies to esports too. People are fans of specific games and specific titles. Now, I bring up all of this because when we think of the esports industry, it's very easy to think of it as just kind of being esports, and I'm using that in air quotes right now. But what you really need to do is think of League of Legends as baseball and Counter-Strike Global Offensive as basketball.
Different types of sports, different type of sections of it.
That's exactly right. And so what's going to eventually happen as these get bigger and bigger is the media is going to be concentrated for viewers of those games specifically. So you're correct in saying that right now, no one's really hit it, no one has it right in trying to cover esports overall, but we do see that if you dig into individual communities and individual sites, people are pretty close to covering their specific games correctly. And I think once some of those games truly hit more mass appeal, we see a couple of games that are quickly on their way of getting their League of Legends, CSGO, etc., then I think you're going to see that trend turns around a little bit.
I agree. So you're the VP of RektGlobal. Okay, you're over there. I guess you guys do a bunch of stuff regarding esports stuff, but what exactly do you do there? And what, as far as to the common person that doesn't know anything about esports, that doesn't know anything about, any of these different types of things we just discussed, what exactly do you offer people, or at least, you bring to people out there on the internets and stuff?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we're an infrastructure services company, or kind of a traditional sports marketing agency, but for the esports space. So we were founded by veterans in sports marketing. My boss in particular, Dave Bilek, he was the guy, if you're an NBA or NCAA basketball fan, when you see State Farm above the basketball goal stanchion, that's him. He did that. It's one of the most valuable ad placements in sports, period. So, we have a lot of experience of being able to bring value to traditional sports. And obviously, I'm on board as VP of eSports to make sure that all of the partnerships that we get into, all of the groups that we work with are all kind of represented authentically in the scene. We don't want to be perceived, or the brands that we work with to be perceived as just coming into the space. And I'm sure you understand this. People, especially millennials, are very wary of big companies, and it's a situation where a company has to demonstrate that they're really adding value and that they're genuine in wanting to come into this industry. And so that's largely what we do. We guide brands moving into the space.
Nice.
So we're working with, big non-endemic sponsors. We're working with leagues. We're actually in the last stages of acquiring a pro esports team at the moment. And largely our entire goal is to kind of help this whole industry grow with a lot of best practices that, where applicable, have been learned from the traditional sports marketing and sports agency world.
Very cool. So, again, you mentioned earlier that you used to do a show about esports over on SiriusXM, and you used to talk a lot about esports, just in general, as the scene and the culture and stuff, before your position now. What is it that you personally want to see, outside of what you just described, with the new company that you're with now? What is it personally that you want to see done or happen over time with esports as a culture, or just esports as a scene, or just anything in particular that'll help benefit or make the culture a little bit better and probably bigger than what it's ever been before up to this point?
That's a really good question, and I think there's a variety of things that are necessary for esports right now. I think that bigger brands, especially, need to be a lot more considerate about how they're entering the esports space. We've seen up to this point many activations in the past where esports companies have kind of come in where traditional media companies and such have come in and completely ruined their opportunity or completely turn off their brand to this audience. And I think if you want to see this thing grow and you want dollars to be put behind it, you want to continue to do the big arena events that we've been doing up to this point and things like that, then brands need to get to the place where they actually embrace esports. They're not necessarily just trying to replicate what they do in sports here. On top of that, though, I do think that there is a bit on the fans to continue to evangelize esports. And I think that what we have right now through social media, there's a really easy way to be able to get specific opinions out there about individual pieces of content, relay that very quickly to the community. But I think that kind of after the initial wave of esports, we're all just sort of sitting back and waiting on developments to happen, and that's not really the case. We need to continue to push this thing. We need to keep getting out there and recruiting our friends into watching this. If they play a specific game, get them over to the esports, stuff like that. So to answer your question in two parts, more authentic reception of the scene from the actual big brands themselves, but then also it's kind of on us to just keep telling people to come watch this thing.
I agree on both accounts. I feel like eventually, as more brands start to get involved, and maybe you start to get more interesting collaborations and partnerships. Like, I'm surprised, because we have a lot of headsets in the scene, as far as different brandings of headsets with Astros, Turtle Beach, and they kind of get involved with that with teams and stuff. But I would love to see a Beats by Dre or even a Sennheiser even get together and either sponsor a team or create something of a line of tech or something for people to get involved with.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's even more opportunities for just traditional big sports advertising brands that have, non-endemic products that aren't just related to gaming, but signal that this industry is getting bigger and bigger. I mean, we saw companies like Audi and BMW come into, one-off event sponsors. And that's not typical brands that you would have expected to see interfacing with video games in general, much less esports in particular. So, I think as this industry matures, though, we're going to see a lot more of those sort of things happening.
Do you think also maybe the implementation of celebrities really helps with that? Because we've seen in the past before, we'll have different musical artists and other people just come in and either talk about the games or be associated with what's going on and stuff, and maybe that also helps a little bit with bringing in some of the bigger brands and kind of being introduced into the scene like that.
Yeah, I mean, marketing to this audience right now is all about brand loyalty. It's all about demonstrating that you actually have value to add to the scene to buy that loyalty. So, as you're suggesting, influencers, musicians, celebrities, etc., that actually have a real trust with the community are necessary and useful for making sure that the community engages with the brand. So, yeah, definitely.
Interesting stuff. So now we come to the final question, like what we ask every guest here on the show on TK Spotlight, and that's about giving one thing that you feel like you could give to the audience that's listening to this. What is one thing that you could tell them that they could walk away from this episode feeling like they got something out of it, that they're going to either something benefit their life or something that's going to benefit them over time after listening to this episode?
This is more of a personal anecdote and a story than anything else, but way back when, I say way back when, only about 7.5 years ago, when I started commentating StarCraft, I was very much an outsider to the scene. I had no prior affiliations with StarCraft, and even in the industry, initially a lot of people gave me a hard time for trying to get myself involved in a space that was already oversaturated, or people felt that there was already enough voices out there and the scene would be too crowded and it would be impossible to try and get involved. And what I very quickly found was that was absolutely not the case. And I, in fact, would push back with that thought entirely for everyone here. If you're encountering a situation where you're doing work you love and you feel you have a place in it, you feel you have a voice to add, continue to make that voice heard and continue to push forward, because in a place where everyone told me, there's no sense in getting involved in this, you're too late, it won't work, you're not good enough, whatever it might be, I kept working and improved and eventually found myself full-time employed in this industry since that moment. So I would just tell everyone that, continue to work hard at what you love, at what you do, and don't listen to people when they tell you that you can't do something, because odds are if you work hard enough, you'll be able to make it work anyway.
Very true. Some good words there. So I definitely am pretty sure a lot of people listening back to this right now would appreciate that, because there's probably at least 1 or 2, maybe 100 different people that will listen to this and they needed to hear something like that, which is always awesome. But Kevin, thank you for coming onto the show, talking esports with me, whole bunch of stuff. So where can everybody find you right now? Where are you at? What social media are you at?
Yeah, I mean, primarily Twitter is where you'll find me. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, I think. I don't know, but don't expect my ass to post any pictures. But feel free to hit me up on Twitter at Kevin Knocke.
Nice. Awesome. So thank you again, Kevin, for chatting it up with me here on the show. Guys, if you're listening to this right now, there'll be links in the description box as well as also on the website for you guys to go check out Kevin on Twitter. Make sure you guys hit up the comment section. Let me know what's up. If you guys enjoyed this episode, if you guys had any other thoughts about some of the stuff we talked about, if you guys also have suggestions for different guests you guys want me to bring on the show, put it in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe to the Koalition's YouTube channel for all our videos related to TK Spotlight, the Co-op podcast, all our gaming related videos and reviews, a whole bunch of stuff and great content for you guys to enjoy. Don't forget to check out the show on iTunes. We are on iTunes. Make sure you guys share the show around. Make sure you rate it. Make sure you guys leave comments on there. That way the show could get even bigger and better, and we could do a whole bunch of other cool stuff and have amazing discussions with even more phenomenal people here on TK Spotlight. But with that being said, we will talk to you guys again very soon. Peace out and stay epic, everybody.